Racist woman tried to kick Big Shaq out, but had no idea who she was messing with. She saw a black man on a luxury estate and assumed he was trespassing. She called security, confident they'd take her side. She thought she had all the power. But when he made one call, everything changed. Who was he? What did he reveal? And why did she walk away in total disgrace? Stay till the end, because this takedown is unforgettable. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The sun hung low over the vast rolling hills of Shaq's private estate, painting the sky in soft orange hues. The air smelled of freshly cut grass and old oak, the kind of peaceful stillness that made city life feel like a distant memory. This was exactly why Big Shaq had bought this farmhouse. To escape, to breathe, to exist in peace. Dressed in a casual designer tracksuit, Shaq walked across his land, enjoying the simplicity of the moment. His black luxury SUV was parked near the house, the sleek shine reflecting the last light of the day. But just as he reached the wooden fence near the orchard, something shattered the silence. A sharp, condescending voice called out from behind him. "Excuse me, but what exactly do you think you're doing here?" Shaq turned, slowly, eyebrows lifting as he took in the woman striding toward him. She was tall, blonde, draped in an expensive beige trench coat, oversized sunglasses perched on her nose, and an expression that reeked of entitlement. Shaq didn't recognize her, but something about the way she held herself, chin high, lips pursed in disapproval, made it clear that she had already decided he was in the wrong. Meredith Vaughn stopped a few feet away from him, crossing her arms. "You're not supposed to be here," she said, her tone slow, deliberate, as if she were explaining something to a child. Shaq chuckled under his breath, shaking his head slightly. "Funny," he said. "I was just about to say the same to you." Meredith's nose wrinkled. "Excuse me," Shaq gestured around, completely unbothered. "You're standing on my land." Meredith let out a sharp laugh. "That's impossible," she said. "This property belongs to the Vaughn family. My family has lived in this community for over 50 years. There's no way someone like you owns it." Shaq's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes sharpened. Someone like you. There it was. He had heard it before, felt it before, seen it 1,000 times in different ways. The way people like her assumed power, assumed ownership, assumed he didn't belong. "You're mistaken," Shaq said, his voice calm but firm. "I bought this estate 2 years ago. It hasn't belonged to the Vaughns in a long time." Meredith's lips parted slightly, but then her expression twisted into immediate disbelief. "No," she said flatly. "You're lying." Shaq exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand down his face. This wasn't happening. He wasn't in the mood for this. He had come here to unwind, not to argue with a stranger about facts. "You think I just wandered onto a multi-million-dollar estate for fun?" he asked, voice laced with amusement. Meredith's face hardened. "I think you're trespassing, and I think you need to leave. Right now." Shaq let out a slow breath. "Look, lady." "Meredith." She corrected him sharply, eyes flashing. "And you need to go." Shaq just stared at her, unimpressed. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, his voice a little colder now. Meredith stepped closer, as if her proximity could intimidate him. "You don't understand," she said, lowering her voice as if giving him one last chance. "This is a private community. People like you." Shaq's head tilted slightly, his eyes narrowing. "People like me?" Meredith's lips tightened, as if she had said too much. "I'm calling security," she announced, pulling out her rose gold iPhone with perfectly manicured fingers. "You have exactly 3 minutes to walk off this property before they get here." Shaq laughed, genuinely entertained now. "Go ahead," he said, crossing his arms. "I'll wait." Meredith's fingers flew across her screen as she barked into the phone. "This is Meredith Vaughn. I need security at my estate immediately. There's a suspicious man trespassing near the orchard." Shaq watched her, expression unreadable. The way she said suspicious man instead of trespasser. The way she still called it my estate even after she had been told otherwise. She had already rewritten reality in her head. The orchard gate creaked as a cool breeze swept through the land. Shaq could see it now. Two outcomes. One where he walked away, let her have her illusion of control, and avoided the inevitable circus that was coming. Or one where he stood his ground, where he made her face the truth in front of everyone she had called to back her up. The second option sounded a lot more fun. Meredith ended the call, slipping her phone back into her coat pocket. She smiled, not a friendly smile, a victorious one. "They'll be here soon," she said, shifting her weight onto one hip. "I'd hate for this to get messy." Shaq let out a slow chuckle, shaking his head. "You have no idea what you've just done, do you?" Meredith blinked. "Excuse me?" Shaq didn't answer. Instead, he turned toward the horizon, where a line of dust was already forming in the distance. Security was coming. But so was something much bigger. And Meredith Vaughn? She was about to learn a lesson she'd never forget. The distant hum of approaching vehicles broke the tense silence. Shaq stood firm, arms crossed, watching as two black SUVs rolled up the gravel driveway, kicking up dust. The private security team had arrived, just as Meredith Vaughn had promised. A muscular man in his late 40s, dressed in a crisp black uniform with a tactical vest, stepped out first. His name tag read Henderson, and his presence screamed authority, but the kind that answered to money. Behind him, two more guards emerged, equally serious, equally uninterested in the truth. Meredith immediately walked toward them, her heels clicking against the stone pathway, her entire body language shifting. Gone was the hysterical woman making threats. Now, she was the victim. And Shaq knew exactly what was coming next. "Thank God you're here," Meredith exclaimed, her voice trembling just enough to sound believable. Henderson barely spared Shaq a glance before turning his full attention to her. "What's the situation, ma'am?" he asked, his tone polite, professional, but already biased. Meredith pressed a hand to her chest, taking a calculated breath. "This man," she said, pointing directly at Shaq, "was wandering around my property, acting suspicious. When I confronted him, he became hostile, aggressive. I honestly feared for my safety." Shaq let out a low, disbelieving chuckle. Meredith's performance was flawless. But her biggest mistake? She was performing for the wrong audience. Henderson finally looked at Shaq, his expression cool, unreadable. "You have any reason to be here?" he asked, his voice edged with disinterest, as if Shaq was already guilty. Shaq exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "Yeah," he said, tone even, unbothered. "Because this is my property." Henderson's eyebrows lifted slightly. Meredith laughed sharply. "He's lying," she snapped. "Check the records. This is Vaughn family land. My family has owned it for generations." Shaq's jaw tightened. "That's funny," he said, slipping his hands into his pockets. "Because I have legal documents that say otherwise." Meredith's eyes flickered for half a second, a crack in her armor. But before she could speak, Henderson took a step forward, his posture hardening. "Sir," he said, his tone now more forceful, "I need you to step off the property while we verify that claim." Shaq let out a short breath, his patience running thin. "You want me to step off my own land so you can verify something you should have asked for before taking her word for it?" Henderson's expression didn't change. "Let's not make this more difficult than it needs to be." Shaq smirked, shaking his head. "Difficult?" His voice dropped slightly, laced with amusement. "Nah. I'm just curious how often you let rich people rewrite reality." A murmur rippled through the small crowd that had started to form near the entrance of the farmhouse. Neighbors, farmhands, and local workers had been drawn in by the commotion, some standing on the dirt path, others leaning against their trucks, watching. Some whispered in confusion, their eyes darting between Shaq and Meredith. Others, especially those who had known the Vaughn family for years, nodded in agreement with whatever Meredith said, no questions asked. A tall man in a plaid shirt, arms crossed, muttered, "I've never seen him around here before." A woman in sunglasses shook her head. "You know how it is. You give some people a little money, and they think they belong anywhere." Shaq heard every word, and it was exactly what he expected. Meredith, sensing the crowd's energy shifting in her favor, doubled down. I saw him trying to get into the house, she added, her voice carrying just enough urgency to spark doubt. Shaq's eyebrow lifted. Henderson, already biased, immediately turned back to Shaq. Sir, if you were trying to enter the residence without permission, that's trespassing. Shaq couldn't believe what he was hearing. Trying to enter, he repeated, chuckling dryly. I have keys in my pocket. Would you like me to unlock the front door for you? More whispers from the crowd. A flicker of uncertainty flashed across Henderson's face. But Meredith? She had no intention of backing down. Meredith stepped forward, her frustration turning into fury. Enough of this, she snapped. I don't care what he says. He needs to leave now. Shaq's face didn't change. He stood there, unmoving. You're on my property, he said, his voice dangerously calm. You don't have the authority to make demands here. Meredith's mouth tightened. She turned to Henderson, her tone sharp, entitled. Why is he still standing here? She demanded. Henderson hesitated. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him. Shaq saw the doubt creeping into the man's expression. You know what's funny? Shaq said suddenly, his tone casual. You haven't even asked for proof. You just assumed she was right. More whispers. A few members of the crowd shifted uncomfortably. Henderson exhaled through his nose. Fine, he muttered. Let's see it then. Shaq reached into his pocket, pulling out a leather wallet. Meredith's smug expression faltered. But as Shaq opened it, pulling out his ownership papers, something even bigger happened. A black Rolls-Royce Phantom appeared at the edge of the property, rolling to a slow, deliberate stop. It was sleek, expensive, and unmistakably important. The entire energy of the moment shifted. The car door opened, and out stepped a tall, sharp-dressed black man in an expensive suit. His presence alone commanded attention. Meredith's face drained of color, because she knew exactly who he was. And for the first time since this all started, she looked afraid. The air felt thick, charged with unspoken tension. Meredith Vaughn stood tall, arms crossed, radiating arrogance. Around her, the security guards positioned themselves as if they were dealing with an actual trespasser, as if Shaq was the one who needed to explain himself. But Shaq? Shaq was done playing along. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. Not in a hurry, not flustered, not angry. Just calm, controlled, deadly, smooth. The small crowd of bystanders watched closely, curious about what he was doing. Meredith scoffed. Calling for backup? She mocked, rolling her eyes. I hate to break it to you, but security is already here. Shaq didn't react. He simply dialed a number, lifted the phone to his ear, and spoke. Yeah, I need them here. Now. Just 5 words. Then he ended the call. The way he did it, so casual, so certain, made the guards shift uneasily. Something was off. And for the first time, Meredith felt it too. The wind whistled through the trees, carrying the distant sound of birds, the rustling of leaves. It was the only noise as Shaq slid his phone back into his pocket and glanced at his watch. Not in a rush, just waiting. Meredith frowned, glancing at the security guards for reassurance. No one moved. What's the problem? She snapped, her voice a little less steady now. He obviously has nothing. If he had proof of ownership, he would have shown it already. Shaq smirked, slow, confident, and maddening. You talk too much, he said simply. Meredith's face flushed. The crowd murmured, picking up on the shift in energy. Then, the distant roar of engines broke through the silence. Heads turned toward the entrance of the property, where a sleek convoy of black SUVs appeared over the horizon. 3, then 4, then 5. Moving in perfect formation, they glided toward the estate like sharks through water. The crowd instinctively stepped back, sensing something important was about to happen. Meredith, however, stood frozen, her lips parted slightly, eyes locked on the approaching vehicles. Her arrogance had been so absolute, so unshakable, until now. Because she recognized that convoy, and she didn't like what it meant. The SUVs came to a smooth, synchronized stop, engines cutting off in unison. For a moment, no one moved. Then, the door of the lead SUV swung open, and out stepped Dominic Blackwell. A man who didn't just command respect, he demanded it. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in an immaculate charcoal suit, with diamond cufflinks that caught the light, Dominic moved with the air of a man who owned every room he walked into. Shaq barely turned his head. "Good timing," he muttered. Dominic adjusted his gold tie pin, barely sparing a glance at the security guards before locking eyes with Meredith. "Would someone like to explain to me," he said, voice smooth as silk, sharp as a knife, "why my client is being harassed on his own property?" Meredith blinked. Once. Twice. Then, like a switch, she snapped back into character. "You're mistaken," she said quickly, squaring her shoulders. "This isn't his property. It belongs to the Vaughn family, and he's been trespassing." "Stop," Dominic said. Just one word. But the weight of it shut her down instantly. She swallowed, but her jaw stayed tight, her nails digging into the fabric of her coat. Dominic didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He pulled out a sleek leather folder, flipping it open with the ease of a man who had done this 1,000 times before. "Let's clear this up," he said, pulling out a set of documents. He held them up, tapping the top sheet. Legal deed, property ownership, full rights transferred to Shaquille Dorsey, signed, sealed, notarized. Dominic turned to Henderson, the lead security guard. "Since you're so eager to enforce rules," he said coolly, "I assume you'd like to read them for yourself?" Henderson stepped forward hesitantly, eyes scanning the paperwork. His throat bobbed. Because there it was, black and white proof. Shaq owned everything. Meredith could feel it happening. The shift, the power, once so solidly in her hands, was slipping away fast. She whipped around to Henderson, desperate. "You're not just going to believe this, are you?" she demanded. "This could be fake." Henderson, suddenly looking very uncomfortable, took a slow step back. "Ma'am, I think we should step away and let this be handled legally." Meredith's breath hitched. "No, no, no," she snapped. "You saw him. He was acting suspicious. He threatened me." Dominic arched a brow, flipping to another document. "Good thing there are cameras on the estate," he said casually. "Would you like me to pull the footage? Or maybe we should call the actual police and let them take a statement." The color drained from Meredith's face. She was trapped. The small crowd of bystanders had grown quiet, watching in fascination as Meredith Vaughn, the woman who had spent years lording over this community, stood cornered like a deer in headlights. A murmur spread. "I told you this wasn't her land anymore. She was lying from the start. Why am I not surprised?" Meredith heard every word. She turned back to Shaq, her lips parting as if she was about to say something. But Shaq was already walking away. He was done. And that stung the most, because in the end, he didn't even see her as a threat. She had lost so badly she wasn't even worth his time anymore. "Wait!" Her voice cracked slightly as she grabbed at one last shred of control. Shaq paused, turning back slightly, expression bored. "You can't just leave," she said. "This isn't over." Dominic smirked, stepping beside Shaq. "Oh, but it is," he said smoothly. Meredith's hands curled into fists, because she knew, deep down, this was over. Her lie had collapsed. Her reputation was crumbling. And worst of all, the entire town had seen it happen. The security team walked away first, stepping back toward their SUVs, refusing to look at her. The crowd moved next, dispersing with quiet murmurs, shaking their heads. And Meredith? She was left standing there, alone, surrounded by land that had never belonged to her in the first place. Shaq exhaled, shaking his head. "Some people never learn," he muttered. Then he turned, hands in his pockets, and walked toward the house he actually owned. Because while Meredith Vaughn had spent her life believing she was untouchable, she had just learned what it felt like to be completely powerless. A sharp breeze swept through the estate, carrying with it the weight of a truth Meredith Vaughn could no longer escape. She had built her entire identity on control, on her ability to speak and be believed without question. But now the very people who once nodded along to her every word were watching her crumble. And she felt it. Her hands clenched at her sides, her nails digging into her palms as she forced herself to hold her ground. She couldn't let them see her break. Not here. Not now. Not in front of him. She inhaled sharply, lifting her chin. "I was just looking out for the neighborhood," she said, her voice tight, brittle. A weak attempt at control. A desperate reach for the last piece of power slipping through her fingers. The crowd that had gathered during the confrontation wasn't just watching anymore. They were talking. And Meredith could hear them. A woman in a navy blazer, arms crossed, leaned toward the man beside her. "Isn't she the same one who accused the delivery guy of acting suspicious last year?" The man frowned. "Yeah. And didn't she call the cops on that teenage kid for riding his bike past her house?" Another voice, louder now. "Wait, I remember her from that HOA meeting. She lost it when they approved new buyers for the house down the street, said they didn't fit the community's image." The words cut through the air like knives. Meredith's throat went dry. She spun toward the murmuring crowd, eyes flashing with warning. "None of that is relevant," she snapped, her voice sharper than she intended. "I was only making sure this property was safe." Shaq exhaled, shaking his head. "Safe?" His voice was smooth, casual, dangerously controlled. "From what exactly?" Meredith's jaw tightened. "You," she shot back before she could stop herself. Silence. The weight of that one word settled over the crowd. Shaq's lips curled into a slow smirk, and that's when he went in for the kill. "You know," he said, slipping his hands into his pockets, "this is funny to me." Meredith's arms crossed tightly, her breathing uneven. Shaq tilted his head slightly, studying her. "You were so sure I didn't belong here," he continued. "Didn't ask for proof. Didn't ask for ID. Didn't ask a single question before calling security." His voice dropped slightly, the air around them shifting. "But when I ask you for proof that this land is yours?" He let out a short laugh. "Suddenly facts don't matter." A ripple of agreement ran through the crowd. Meredith felt it slipping further now. She forced herself to hold her ground. Shaq cut her off. "You assumed you could lie, make a scene, and people would just believe you," he said, his voice razor sharp now. "Because that's what's always happened before, right?" Meredith's face burned. The security guards, the same ones who had backed her without hesitation, were now standing awkwardly off to the side, avoiding eye contact. She turned toward them. "Well," she demanded, "are you just going to stand there and let him talk to me like this?" Henderson, the head of security, let out a slow breath. "Ma'am," he said carefully, his tone different now, colder, distant. "We've seen the paperwork. He owns the estate." Meredith's stomach twisted violently. "That doesn't mean he should be here," she hissed, desperate. "He could still be—" Enough. It was Dominic Blackwell, Shaq's lawyer, stepping forward. His presence alone silenced everyone. "We're done entertaining this nonsense," he said, his voice as smooth as it was sharp. "Meredith Vaughn, you've made false claims, harassed my client, and wasted everyone's time." Meredith's breath hitched. "I was just trying to—" Dominic held up a hand. "I don't care," he said flatly, "because here's what's going to happen next." Meredith swallowed hard. "You're going to leave," Dominic continued, "and you're not going to cause another scene. Because if you do—" He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "We will press charges." The color drained from Meredith's face. The word charges hung in the air, sharp and heavy. She stumbled for words, looking around, hoping, praying. Someone would speak up for her. No one did. The security team was silent. The neighbors were watching, but none would step in. Even the guards who had originally backed her without question were now taking slow steps away from her. And Shaq? Shaq wasn't even looking at her anymore. He was checking his watch, like she was an afterthought, like she was already gone. And somehow that hurt worse than anything else. Meredith Vaughn had spent her life winning, and now she had finally, truly lost. Meredith's hands shook. She couldn't let it end like this. She couldn't let them destroy her like this. She started, forcing herself to lift her chin. "I don't owe anyone an apology." The crowd stared. Shaq let out a short, quiet laugh, finally looking at her. Of course you don't, he said simply. You'd have to understand what you did wrong first. Meredith's jaw locked. Shaq held her gaze for 3 long seconds. Then, he turned away. Just like that. No anger. No threats. No need to fight her anymore. Because the truth had already done its job. And now, Meredith Vaughn wasn't worth another second of his time. Meredith's breath hitched painfully as she watched Shaq walk toward his house. The house she had tried to claim wasn't his. No one was looking at her anymore. They had moved on. She had gone from the most powerful woman in the room to nothing at all. Her fingers twitched, her pulse hammering as she forced herself to turn away. The walk back to her car felt endless. Every step was a reminder that she had been seen, exposed, and humiliated. She slid into the driver's seat, gripping the wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her phone buzzed. A message. From her lawyer. She stared at the notification, her stomach sinking. Because whatever was coming next, she wasn't ready for it. Us. The sun had started its slow descent, casting a golden glow over the estate. But for Meredith Vaughn, the warmth of the evening did nothing to ease the chill crawling up her spine. She had lost control of the situation. Badly. And Shaq? Shaq had barely lifted a finger to make it happen. But he wasn't done yet. As the murmurs from the crowd swirled around her, as the security teams silently distanced themselves, and as Dominic Blackwell's legal threat still hung in the air, Shaq reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone again. One more call. Just one. He dialed, lifted the phone to his ear, and spoke in that same deadly calm voice that had already shaken Meredith to her core. Yeah, I need an officer at my property. Got a case of trespassing, harassment, and false accusations. Then, just like before, he hung up without another word. No urgency, no pleading, just a fact. Learned what it felt like to be completely powerless. And in that moment, Meredith Vaughn realized her nightmare was far from over. It didn't take long. Within minutes, the distant wail of a police siren sliced through the tense air. The crowd, already buzzing with whispers, turned toward the road as a black and white patrol car rolled onto the property, stopping just a few feet from the standoff. A uniformed officer stepped out, adjusting his belt as he surveyed the scene. Officer Logan Tate. Tall, broad, a man who had seen enough nonsense in his career to recognize it instantly. His sharp gaze swept over the situation, the awkward-looking security guards, the small crowd watching like it was a reality show, the furious woman standing rigid with her arms crossed, and then finally, Shaq. Tate's brow lifted slightly. Mr. Dorsey, he said, nodding in recognition. Didn't expect to get a call from you today. Shaq smirked slightly, his hands still casually tucked into his pockets. Didn't expect to have to make one, he replied. Meredith's throat went dry. Wait, they knew each other? She opened her mouth, ready to launch into another one of her performances. The same helpless act that had always worked before. But before she could get a single word out, Tate lifted a hand. Hold on, he said, tone firm. I want to hear from him first. Meredith stiffened. That wasn't how this was supposed to go. Dominic Blackwell stepped forward, his polished shoes crunching against the gravel. Officer Tate, let me save you some time, he said smoothly, passing over a document. This is a legal deed confirming that this property is fully owned by Shaquille Dorsey. Meredith Vaughn, on the other hand, has repeatedly harassed my client, attempted to have him removed from his own home, and made false accusations that could have led to unlawful detainment. Tate's jaw tightened. His eyes flicked to Meredith. Is that true? He asked. Meredith immediately scoffed. Of course not, she snapped. This is a misunderstanding. I was just trying to protect the neighborhood. Shaq let out a quiet, disbelieving laugh. Tate sighed, rubbing a hand down his face. That's not how this looks, ma'am. Meredith's stomach clenched. Why wasn't he taking her side? Officer Tate took a step closer, his presence suddenly a lot more intimidating. Let me get this straight, he said. You saw Mr. Dorsey on his own property and assumed he was trespassing? Meredith's mouth opened. I didn't know it was his property. Tate nodded slowly. Uh-huh. And instead of verifying that, you called private security to have him removed. Meredith flushed. I thought... Tate cut her off. And then, when presented with legal proof that this land belongs to him, you still refuse to acknowledge it? Meredith's hands curled into fists. This is ridiculous, she snapped. I was just looking out for the community. Tate's brows furrowed. He glanced around the gathered crowd. Anyone here ask her to do that? He called out. Silence. Then, not me, a voice muttered. She does this all the time, someone else added. Meredith's pulse skyrocketed. Tate exhaled, shaking his head. Yeah, he muttered. That's what I thought. Meredith's world was collapsing fast. Every time she tried to speak, she was cut off. Every time she tried to justify herself, the facts turned against her. And worst of all, no one was coming to her defense. Not the crowd, not the security team, not even the officer who had always worked for her family before. Because Shaq hadn't just flipped the script. He had burned the entire stage down. Tate crossed his arms. You know, ma'am, he said slowly, false accusations are a serious offense. Meredith's heart nearly stopped. You can't be serious, she sputtered. You're actually considering... Tate nodded toward Shaq. Would you like to press charges? Meredith felt the ground drop beneath her feet. The crowd went silent. All eyes turned to Shaq. He could end her here. One simple yes, one word, and she would be dragged off her imaginary throne, arrested and humiliated on every news outlet. Shaq stared at her for a long moment. Meredith held her breath, her entire body rigid. Then, he shook his head. Nah, he said, exhaling. Not worth it. Meredith let out a choked gasp, relief flooding her veins. But then, Shaq took a step closer, looking her dead in the eyes. But trust me, he said, voice low, cold, meant only for her. The world is gonna hear about this. And next time, there won't be a choice. His meaning was clear. Today she had gotten off easy. Tomorrow, she wouldn't be so lucky. Officer Tate gave her one last unimpressed look. I suggest you leave before we find a reason to change our minds. Meredith's breath shuddered. Her hands trembled as she turned on her heel, her entire body burning with humiliation. She didn't bother saying another word, didn't bother looking back. She just stumbled toward her car, knowing that the moment she got home, the real nightmare would begin. Because Shaq was right. This wasn't going to stay quiet. It was going to follow her forever. And worst of all, she had done it to herself. Meredith Vaughn's world wasn't just falling apart. It was being broadcasted in real time. By the time she had stumbled back to her car, humiliated, shaken, and barely holding herself together, the damage had already been done. Because while she was fighting for control, making false claims, and watching her privilege crumble, she had missed one crucial detail. The cameras never stopped rolling. The first clip hit Twitter just before sunset. A short, 40-second video, captioned, "Racist woman tries to kick a black millionaire off his own property. Instantly regrets it." The video showed everything. The arrogant way Meredith approached Shaq. The way she called security without hesitation. The moment she realized she had no power left. And worst of all, her final humiliation. Shaq turning away like she wasn't even worth his time. It spread like wildfire. Within an hour, 50,000 views. By midnight, 2.7 million. And by morning, everyone was talking about it. The internet never forgets. And once Meredith's name was out there, people dug deeper. Within hours, old posts, complaints, and reports started surfacing. An HOA dispute where she tried to block new homeowners from moving in, claiming they didn't fit the neighborhood's standards. A viral thread about her calling the cops on a black teenager for lingering too long near her driveway. A recorded phone call from a customer service worker exposing her for making racist remarks after an order got delayed. The more they found, the worse it got. Screenshots flooded Reddit, Twitter, and Instagram. Headlines appeared on news sites. Karen gets exposed, the downfall of Meredith Vaughn. Another day, another racist caught on camera. Her entire history of entitlement was now public record, and there was no coming back from it. Meredith's phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Every call, every text, every email was another piece of her life collapsing. The first real hit came from her employer. A firm, professional email from the corporate office of Vaughn and Moore, the high-end real estate company where she worked. Effective immediately, your employment with Vaughn and Moore is terminated. Your recent actions do not align with our company's values. Fired. Not a warning, not a suspension. Just gone. And it didn't stop there. Her name vanished from company websites. Her profile was removed from every professional listing. She was officially toxic. She wasn't just losing her job. She was losing everything. Brands she had collaborated with in the past, luxury retailers, local businesses, charity events, publicly cut ties. We do not support the actions of Meredith Vaughn. We have removed her from all future partnerships. Meredith Vaughn has been removed from our board of donors. We stand against discrimination. We have ended all associations with Meredith Vaughn. Even her social circles started dropping her. The group chats went silent. Friends who had once supported her at charity galas, exclusive clubs, and community events, now, they weren't responding to her texts. And then, the final blow. Her personal Instagram, once filled with filtered selfies, vacations, and expensive brunches, was gone. Deleted. Her world had disappeared overnight. While Meredith was watching her life burn Shaq. Shaq was thriving. The same video that destroyed her reputation elevated his. People weren't just watching how Meredith failed. They were watching how Shaq won. The way he stayed calm. The way he never lost control. The way he let facts, not rage, destroy the lie. Headlines flipped the narrative. Class versus entitlement. How Shaq handled a racist, Karen without breaking a sweat. Big Shaq's power move. The lesson that left a privileged woman speechless. This is how you handle injustice, without losing your cool. Even celebrities and public figures jumped in. Actors, athletes, business moguls. All praising Shaq for handling the situation with dignity. This is how you check privilege. A masterclass in keeping your cool. Some people crumble under pressure. Others rise. Shaq is the latter. And just like that, Shaq became a symbol. And Meredith? She became a warning. Days later, after radio silence, Meredith reappeared. Not in person, not on social media, but in a written statement, emailed to a few reporters. A half-baked apology, trying to fix the unfixable. I deeply regret the misunderstanding that took place. I never intended to offend anyone. I was only trying to ensure the safety of my neighborhood. I now see that my actions were misinterpreted, and I am truly sorry for any harm caused. No one bought it, because she wasn't sorry for what she did. She was sorry she got caught. The internet tore her apart. Misunderstanding is wild when you literally called security on a man in his own house. She's not sorry. She's just unemployed. Imagine going viral for being racist and thinking an email will fix it. Her attempt at damage control made it worse. She thought she could smooth this over. But her name was already cemented in history, for all the wrong reasons. In the end, this wasn't just a story about Meredith Vaughn. It was a story about power, about who thinks they have it, and who actually does. Meredith thought privilege made her untouchable. Shaq proved that facts don't bend for entitlement. She screamed, she lied, she fought to the bitter end. Shaq never raised his voice. And still, he won. Because in the end, some people rely on power. Others are power. And now, the world knew the difference. It had been 1 week since the incident. 1 week since Meredith Vaughn's world crumbled before an audience of millions. 1 week since the internet watched her ego collapse in real time. But now, the world was waiting for one final voice to speak. And that voice belonged to Shaq. The setting was modern, sleek, and minimalistic. A high-end talk show, dimly lit, with a polished black table reflecting the overhead lights. Shaq sat across from the host, perfectly at ease, his broad shoulders relaxed, his face unreadable. The interviewer, a respected journalist known for cutting through nonsense, leaned forward slightly. "You haven't said much publicly since the video went viral," she said. "But millions have seen it. People have dissected every moment of what happened that day. Shaq nodded slowly, fingers intertwined on the table. Yeah, he said. I've seen the takes, the debates, the excuses, the justifications. The host tilted her head. And what do you think about all of it? Shaq exhaled. Then he answered in the way only he could. This was never just about me, Shaq said, his voice low, steady, unshakable. This was about who gets believed without question, and who has to fight to prove the truth. The interviewer let that hang in the air for a moment before speaking again. Some people have argued that Meredith Vaughn just made a mistake, she said. That she didn't mean any harm. Shaq chuckled softly, shaking his head. A mistake? He repeated. A mistake is forgetting someone's name. A mistake is taking the wrong freeway exit. His gaze sharpened. A mistake isn't assuming someone doesn't belong in a place just because of who they are. That's a choice. Silence. The weight of his words settled across the room. The interviewer nodded. A lot of people have praised the way you handled the situation. You never raised your voice, never got aggressive. You let the truth do the work. Was that intentional? Shaq leaned back slightly. It wasn't about playing nice, he said. It was about showing that you don't have to match someone's ignorance to beat them. Meanwhile, as Shaq's interview gained traction, Meredith Vaughn was fighting a losing battle. She had gone completely silent for days. Then, a weak attempt at an apology. A typed-out statement, posted in black text on a plain white background. I deeply regret my actions. They were never meant to cause harm. I have taken time to reflect, and I am committed to growing from this experience. No accountability. No direct mention of what she did. Just empty words. The internet didn't buy it. An apology without accountability is just damage control. She's not sorry. She's just unemployed. Notice she still won't say what she actually did wrong. Her social exile remained intact. No invitations, no brand partnerships, no public support. Because some reputations don't recover. The interviewer tapped her pen against the desk, watching Shaq closely. If there's one message you want people to take from all of this, she said, what would it be? Shaq was quiet for a moment. Then he spoke. Power isn't about who talks the loudest. It's about who can stand in the truth without flinching. The words hit hard. Within hours, they were everywhere. Pinned tweets, Instagram captions, headlines, and Meredith Vaughn? She had been reduced to a footnote in someone else's victory. Because at the end of the day, entitlement collapses under truth and Shaq? Shaq never had to lift a finger to prove it. If you loved watching power get flipped on its head, you won't want to miss what's next. We bring you real justice, real takedowns, and real moments where entitlement gets exposed. Follow for more stories that challenge privilege and reveal the truth. Share this if you believe no one is above accountability. Comment below. What would you have done in Shaq's place? Because in a world where lies spread fast, the truth hits even harder.